how do you, as an agile coach, facilitate decision making? Maybe that's the question. It's kind of a loaded or leading question, possibly both, because I feel like sometimes I facilitate conversations where there's not always a clear agreement. We present all the evidence, and then depending on the conversation, it can be decided by a key decision maker, which is one of the ways to make a decision.
Yeah,
but
and a valid one.
A valid one, yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking that first of all, I had a similar conversation very recently, and for me, the question itself is loaded because it assumes that you can actually facilitate it. In a sense, people take decisions with their gut most of the time. There's this brilliant study that I just keep talking about from 3 people regarding how judges make decisions. It was a study they did with like 1,000 cases. It was about parole, granting or not granting it. And I will try to include the graph somewhere here because it's just brilliant how judges become more hungry and they are more punishing with their decisions. So, if judges do that, you can really be soft on business people who do the same. In my head, it's judges who should be very considerate about what decision they make, all the factors, including and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you know the ASH experiment? ASCH is the I assume he was a psychologist. I haven't read the source of it, but it's quoted in a lot of the kind of pop psychology books, the kind of stuff I read. But it's this idea that you can be influenced to give the same answer as other people in a room, even if you think that their answer is wrong. Like you'll just go along with the consensus. So the idea of the experiment is there's someone in a white coat holding up a card saying which is the correct answer. And I think it's something to do with the length of a line or something like that. Which of these matches the line?
Yes.
And you look at the card and say, well, obviously the answer is A. But the first person who is a plant, along with the guy in the white coat, says it's B. And then the second person, who is also a plant, says, yes, it's B. And they proved that a certain number of people, I actually don't think it was 100%, but enough people to make it significant would say B and not question it, Say, yeah. Oh, I thought it was A at first, but enough people have said B now, so I think it's B.
And I guess that goes in all the conversations about cognitive biases, in a sense. If you think about it from the perspective of a single person, you can be influenced by so many factors, like hungry is actually one of the things. And I even saw that happening in real life when people, they want to get fast through the meeting because they're hungry and they want to go for lunch. And yeah, that's one of the factors, but there's a lot of other things. Someone can be in pain because they hurt their leg or whatever is the reason. They might be sleep deprived because of the kid, babies shouting during the night, whatever the reason. It's like a person can be already influenced by a lot of this. And one of the ways of thinking about it is then have more people in the room to gather and collectively maybe, check on each other and make collective decision. But then you enter all the cognitive biases area of how other people influence our decisions, like the one you just mentioned. But it's like the list of cognitive biases is so long. I have some of my favorite ones as well.
I think it's maybe I'll find the image. I'll pretend I'm pointing to it here, but it's a Buster Benson cataloged them at one point. He has a nice visual. It's like a
Yeah,
wheel, really, really good. But of course, that's probably my confirmation bias speaking. That's a joke about iterative biases. But I think to move away from the psychology of it, though, even though I introduced it, I think I'd like to also bring in a topic of like responsibility and accountability, because I notice in some of the conversations that I've had moving away from a team, even sometimes inside a team, the responsibility for decision making and the accountability for that decision are often difficult to understand. So the
yeah,
product owner knows what they want, and the engineering team knows how they want to do it, but they're not always aware of. So I will remember the source by the time we publish this video, but oh, it's the book I mentioned that I just started. A definition of accountability is the ability to change a decision, right? So my level of accountability for this decision is how possible is it for me to change the decision. So if you say yes and I say it's actually no, I become accountable then, right?
yeah.
Which is a nice. But if you say yes and I say no, and the person says, well, tough, like it's my decision, like then they're accountable, okay? And I kind of like that. But what I sometimes see in a large system where there's lots of people involved in a decision, so this is the context I'm thinking about. The the ability to find that accountability is harder, you know? Like
Yeah.
who decides the team structures? You know, who decides what teams go in which collection of teams, and you know, why is that one person's accountability and not another? Like so that that introduces complexity, I think. And those would be, well, that would be one example, I think, of a kind of a
Yeah.
decision that would need facilitation, you know.
And it's very interesting because this is something where the clear decider and the hierarchy somehow steps in because it
Mm,
speeds up so many conversations if it's clear who decides, who can make the decision. It's just interesting because a lot of what I'm doing is actually facilitating a decision between people where each single person does not have this accountability or this is not responsible person, is not the decider. But
mm,
collectively they can come up with something, propose something, and then it's either they have decided as a group and that's good enough, or maybe it's a proposal for someone who will put the approved stamp on it. Uh, but there's also this angle of how can you help the group to make a decision? That's interesting.
mm.
On the accountability, responsibility, that sounds a bit like I remember I read it in one of the engineering manager related books where the delegation was being discussed. What do you delegate? You you delegate. Now I can get it wrong. Responsibility, but the accountability stays with you. Is that the case? That might be the
Yeah,
case.
I yeah, I think that's a nice, interesting one. I'd be interested to see the source of that. But I think perhaps what we're talking about here is also connected to autonomy, right? And if we're talking about teams that perform well, that's got to be one element of it, that they've somehow negotiated for decision making
Yeah,
authority, and that's not just granted, right? You got to build that over time. You got to earn it, and it's based on relationships. But it also sometimes requires, I think, a bit of facilitation, like helping a team see how they're currently making decisions and the alternatives to that. I mean, I don't know who I feel like a scrum master or an agile coach could be accountable for that. You know, and that could be a useful element to bring to a conversation. If you see the wheels stalling, or, you
yeah,
know, going around in circles, like, oh, we're talking about this again. When will we ever make a decision? You know, I brought it to my boss. Do you bring it to your boss? Maybe they'll somehow figure it out. But at the end of the day, I think what if you bring it to the engineering manager example, I think what they want is a presentation of options that have been thought through, and a decision that needs to just be validated. Like I've thought it through. We've talked about it together. Here's what we're going to do. Let me know if you want to change path, or let me know if you want to discuss. And like I'm letting you know what our thought process is. I'm telling you our next step. So we've decided with autonomy, but you have the ability to change the decision. Therefore, we've got the responsibility. You've got the accountability. Does that fit with your?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that makes sense. And it also takes me to the area of like, how do you actually facilitate that conversation for like, first thing I thought about is that there's a nice, super simple exercise that you can do for usually in a team context to have a conversation about the way that they decide. It's like you give them some super simple exercise to do where they need to decide on each step. I think the exercise I originally saw was like a picture is covered by uh, um, sticky notes, and the team needs to decide which sticky note to remove, to see what's underneath, and to guess what's in the picture. And the exercise is super simple. The key point is you have like 5 moves, 5 sticky notes you can remove. And each time you decide as a team, you need to write how did you make this decision. So it's less about guessing what's the picture, although that not adds a nice angle, but it's more how did you decide which sticky note to remove, what conversations you had, and so on. That might be nice to surface those ways that the team communicates. Another thing is surfacing or helping to see all the, again, cognitive biases in a sense. It might be obvious. I have this in my head, tech lead saying that, we are all software engineers here, and everyone input is welcomed, and it's obvious that everyone can speak up. Even when I say that this is how the things are, it's everyone can just say that I'm wrong. And my question to him was like, can they really? Do you think that those people who are, they have 10 years less experience in the company than you, that they will tell you, hey, sorry, you are wrong? Or will they just nod their heads even if they don't really get something, maybe don't agree? They will rather just agree with what is being said. And that's like interesting to surface those type of things that are happening in the team, in a group.
So we talked about the David Marquette book, or I mentioned it last week, the Leadership as Language book, and he's a U.S. Navy retired submarine captain, and he talks about that idea that what you're asking people to do is have a balance between doing their jobs and thinking about their jobs. And he very simply talks about red work, which is the doing of the work, the execution of the tasks, and blue work, which is, okay, let's think about what are we actually doing here? How do we maybe improve what we're doing? So an example like that would be something like a design session where a senior engineer, thinks they're empowering people by saying, you can tell me if I'm doing something wrong, right? But the Marquette example would be curious and ask questions. So if someone hasn't spoken for a while, say,
Yeah.
Pawel, what do you think?
And I think this is super difficult to, like, especially for a less experienced person in terms of facilitation, because you can be like really interested in having a specific outcome, and then it's not your first thing. It's not the first thing that comes to your mind that maybe I should facilitate a bit more. Maybe I should ask silent people for their input. Maybe I'm anchoring them. Maybe we are running out of time and we should now move to a decision point. Or like this is so difficult, actually.
And I agree, and that could be an example where actually being in the facilitator role, you're getting in the way by doing that, and maybe it's more talking to that person and saying, "Hey, like, I'm just noticing you want to encourage this, and I'm hearing when we're in the sessions that there's not a huge amount of questions being asked or interaction from the more junior guys. So, I wonder, would you like to have a chat about that? Because I've been reading a little bit on this topic about decision making and contributions, and maybe it's more of a coaching point or a discussion point rather than a being in the middle of the conversation, because that can maybe create more of a gap between the senior and the junior, because you might feel like you're calling them out,
Yeah.
Whereas it's up to the senior engineer to do it, really. So maybe you're playing the facilitator role by having that conversation outside the session, suggest an experiment,
And I'm thinking that there are some things that really worked well for me as a facilitator host, and maybe they are also worth mentioning. That will shift into more practical stuff. I'm thinking writing down or keeping some visual track of the conversation and proposals that are being made. In a sense, when there's some issue and people start just discussing it, very often I see that ideas are appearing like a bubble and they are popped very quickly because someone says it won't work because this or that. And it's so good to keep track of all the ideas, because then it's something that you can discuss in more detail as options. Another thing is it's very nice to do temperature checks. Like someone proposes something and either someone says I love it, let's do it, or someone says that's a very bad idea. The thing is, it's nice to do a temperature check across the room, putting I like the feeling that people have towards this idea on a scale from whatever I love it to I hate it, because then it's interesting to see that maybe the most outspoken person is not representing majority in the room. It's also something that worked really well for me in the past.
Yeah, and I think also sometimes I'm trying to remember the term for it. There's things like a pre-mortem. So imagine if you have a decision to make, or it looks like a decision is going to go a certain way and it's a bit outside of your control, perhaps. You can analyze it by asking the team, okay, how could this fail? Like, how could we make this not work? How could we make the result of this decision a failure? And that's an interesting kind of exercise, because you start to think about, well, okay, here's the possible problems that we could have. And then a natural follow-on question is, okay, well, how could we avoid those problems? And it becomes like a critical evaluation of the decision, but also your responsibility for whether it's a success or a failure. I think that's a nice one.
Yeah, sounds similar to trees in liberating structures, where you first try to say, something similar. I guess deciding subject is so broad that we can discuss about the delegation as a gradient, not I do it, you do it. That the delegation poker of what are the different ways that the decision can be delegated. What are you delegating actually?
But I think an interesting topic for us to come back to is, in a large group, how accountability can be diffused to the point where the decision just seems to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting phenomenon for people working in large companies. We've all had that feeling like, how did we end up here? Why was this decision made? Who decided this? And it's through the complexity of working in a large organization that it happens.
Yeah, it emerged.
Right. And it seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Or maybe somebody just reached a point where they're like, oh, we've been talking about this for months. Like, a decision is better than none, so let's decide it this way, But a topic for another day anyway.
All right. I don't know if we want to have any recommendations for this one, or are we good with just 20-minute conversation?
Maybe the Buster Benson thing. I like that, the psychological biases. But I'd also be curious about the ones you mentioned about responsibility and accountability. If you could track those down.
Yeah, I think that's quite easy to track down. There were 2 books about engineering managers, and it's one of the 2. I'll just find it.
Yeah, and I won't mention the one I started because I haven't finished. I haven't finished it yet, but so far I'm enjoying it. It's all about accountability.
Let's talk about it next time.
Another time.